OBJ goes Hollywood. Odell Beckham Jr. has signed with the Los Angeles Rams and will be a member of the new greatest show on turf. Odell Beckham Jr., one of the NFL's greatest showmen, will play in Hollywood. I think it's meant to be, really. When you think about it, Odell has had, so far, 2 careers. He's had a career in a big city, in a big market of New York. And he's had a career in a small city, in a small market, Cleveland. He now returns to a big city, under the palm trees and the bright lights. Odell Beckham Jr. will be an LA Ram and will join Matthew Stafford, Von Miller, Jalen Ramsey, Aaron Donald, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, and what they're calling a super team with the Los Angeles Rams. But can Sean McVay make it work? That's the question. So in this video, I will break down the Rams signing Odell and how that might work. Are the Rams Super Bowl favorites now because of this move? Does this change the Rams offense? How does this impact fantasy football? And more. Before I give you my thoughts on OBJ to the Rams, make sure that you do spike that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more NFL reactions just like this. Also, spike that notification bell for the latest upload and live stream. All right, OBJ to the Rams. Like I said, I feel like some players, they just belong under the bright lights. They just belong in the big markets, in the big cities. And I oftentimes feel like some of these athletes perform better in these atmospheres, in these markets. And I think Odell is one of those players. You know, he just never felt at home with the Browns. I don't really think he was ever happy with the Browns. I don't think that situation ever was meant to be. Now, I will say something that's being overlooked a lot in this situation is the fact that OBJ was traded for by one coaching staff and one management, and then basically was no longer, I would say, in their plans when it came to the second set of coaching staff, second set of general management in Cleveland. I think that is a big part of why Odell didn't really work out in his second, third year with the Browns. It looked like it maybe was going to work out in the second year. You know, Odell still looked explosive. He was making plays here and there, but he was never really getting as many targets, as many looks, as much as he really should have been. Right? That's the thing with the Browns, guys. I think people need to understand first, why did it go wrong in Cleveland? And I think simple as, I don't think Odell works in that system the way that he should, right? Like, yeah, everyone's calling him a average receiver because his production, and there's no lies here, you're 100% right, his production is average. But when you look at the Browns and the way they use their wide receivers, how is any wide receiver supposed to have above average production in that system? Simply, Odell was not used to his best. He was only really used as a vertical threat, and oftentimes he just didn't have good chemistry with his quarterback, Baker Mayfield. And that can be shown with stats. Not only is Baker a better player without Odell on the field, but Odell wasn't even getting targeted accurately. According to ESPN Stats and Info, he was the actually least accurate quarterback targeting a single receiver in the NFL. 32.4% of Odell Beckham Jr.'s targets this year. So 11 of 34 have been off target. That means they're in no vicinity, no range to catch the ball. Okay? That is the highest off-target percentage of any receiver this season. That's among 71 players with 30-plus targets. The only receiver at 30% or higher is Robbie Anderson. Okay? So that's the only other player who had Sam Darnold. So I think there's blame to be had with just the usage of Odell. I don't think the Browns were really creative with his skill set. And I don't think Baker Mayfield was necessarily giving him the opportunity to shine as the player that he thinks he is and the player that I think he is. So honestly, if you're sitting here and one of those people saying, Odell can't play anymore, he's an average player, I think you're simply looking at the stats. You're not watching him play. There is a very insightful video out there on YouTube. A big reason why he was released is the video on YouTube basically showing you all the times Odell was open this year. And not only was he open just by finding soft spots in the zone, a lot of receivers can do that, but also through route running, through beating man coverage, just separating, getting open, using his speed, using his quickness, using his route running, using his capability as a good receiver to get open, and still Baker wasn't targeting him. So there was just a lot of issues in Cleveland. Now that's behind him. The question is, can OBJ ever be the guy that he was in New York? Can he ever be this guy? That's the question. And I feel like he'll never, ever quite be that guy again. I did a lot as a Patriots fan. I was very invested in this because I thought there was a chance that my team could get Odell. And I've been a fan of Odell Beckham Jr. for quite some time. He's one of my favorite players in the league. And he is, in fact, I believe the most popular player through social media. On Instagram, I believe he's the most followed player in the NFL, which I think is where he gets the label of being overrated. But when you look at his career, right, he began his career with the Giants as on pace to be one of the greatest receivers of all time. His first 3 seasons, he had 1,300 yards, 1,400 yards, 1,300 yards, 90-plus catches in each year, and in 2 of those seasons, he didn't even play in 16 games. His rookie year was probably the best rookie season of all time, right? So he was having a Randy Moss-type beginning of his career in New York. But why was that happening? Like, what type of player was he? Okay, so not only was Odell really good down the field. And this is another issue I see from a lot of people analyzing this situation. A lot of people see Odell simply as a deep threat, but that's not really what he's ever been. Odell is a deep threat. He has speed to separate down the field. That is part of his game. And that is what we most label with great receivers, right? Number one receivers is he's a downfield receiver. He's a downfield receiver. But OBJ was special because he could create something after the catch with the Giants. And that is where I don't think he's ever really been given the chance in Cleveland. He's been used as a kind of clear out option for the offense, for the run game, as an addition to it, not as a focal point. And that is where I think Odell took problem to the situation in Cleveland, because he just simply felt, as any great athlete, if you've ever played a sport, you would be frustrated if you're not being utilized the way that you think you should be utilized. Even Deshaun Jackson had a problem with it, and Deshaun Jackson's far past his prime. It's not even close to Odell Beckham Jr. But, OBJ, and we'll get to that comparison a little bit later, the fact that Deshaun left the Rams, but OBJ now, with the Rams, could have an opportunity to get back closer to what he was. And I think when you just go on YouTube, do the work, just look at highlights. You don't even got to look at full games. Just look at highlights from 2016 with the Giants and look at highlights from last year with the Browns. Clearly, Odell is not the same explosive player. In 2015, 2016, 2014, Odell was one of the most explosive receivers of all time. Like, legitimate game-changing on one play type ability. With the Browns, he slowed down. Part of that was injuries, right? But he's still really good. And that is where I think people are missing the boat here. I also think as potentially a number 2, number 3 option, that's even better, because now he won't see all the focus, right? Like he did with the Browns, because quite simply, he was their best, most talented wide receiver, and defensive coordinators still treated him that way with the Browns. So there's a lot of things here. And then when you compare him to a guy like Randy Moss, okay? And this comparison has been made very many times here, but it's actually a very good comparison. As I mentioned, Randy Moss had a very good beginning to his career. So did Odell. Actually, Odell was outproducing the early seasons of even Randy Moss, who's arguably, the best receiver or most talented receiver of all time, probably the second greatest receiver of all time. But when you look at the numbers, right? So Randy Moss, people forget, he kind of fell off with the Raiders. Like, he wasn't the same player. He went to the Raiders, a very similar type situation to the Browns, and both in 29 games saw similar target numbers. Odell caught more passes, had more yards, and only less touchdowns. So if we're going to say that Odell is washed at this point, 2019 to 2021, I think both had one 1,000-yard season, right? If we're going to say that Odell is washed right now, then you must have been one of those people saying Randy Moss was washed in 05-06. But in fact, when you watch the tape suggests that this guy still had something left. And that's exactly what Bill Belichick saw in that. And I don't think there's a coincidence that Bill Belichick also was interested in Odell Beckham Jr. because I think he still sees that this player can play. Maybe he's not the guy that he was, but he's still really, really good. And that, I think, is what the Rams are getting. So there's a lot to be said about this situation. I think other people will have problems with the fact that this is a very good football team who has a good record, and Odell is also seen as sort of a locker room cancer. But I'm going to ask you two questions. Number one is, has a teammate of Odell Beckham's ever spoken negatively about him? That's number one. Number two, what off-field issue has he ever had? So now that you have time thinking about that, much of this has been media driven. And I think why LA remains a great situation for Odell is the fact that he goes to a locker room with many peers. And what I mean by peers is I mean alpha, Hall of Fame talent type players. When he went to Cleveland, he was in basically control, because he was going to a team that had a losing culture. He was almost the leader of the team because Baker was the quarterback and Baker was a rookie, right? So a lot was on his plate in terms of he felt, I think, he was responsible for this team, whether they were going to achieve or whether they were going to fail. And I think with the Rams, you look at that locker room. You got Von Miller, Hall of Fame. Jalen Ramsey, Hall of Fame talent. Aaron Donald, Hall of Fame. Matthew Stafford's been in the league for a very long time, could be on his way to the Hall of Fame. You've got a lot of players that are alpha male types that are friends of Odell, like Von Miller has a close relationship with him. And I just think that is not going to allow any sort of off script from OBJ. If you're concerned about that at all, I wouldn't, because I think that's always been overblown. But secondly, I feel like with those guys in that locker room, that's not going to happen, especially with Sean McVay as the coach. When you really think about it, Odell's never had a coach anywhere close to Sean McVay in terms of his presence, in terms of his respect he demands, in terms of how good and talented he is. So then when you transfer that to the field, Sean McVay is going to find ways to get Odell the ball because he's an offensive mastermind, or at least that's his reputation. And what Sean McVay does really well is he is a former receiver. And I think what he's brought to the NFL as an offensive coordinator, offensive mastermind, is his ability to get wide receivers the ball and get them open. And I feel like Odell already can get himself open. If you give him a one-on-one, he'll get open. But you see Cooper Kupp, you see Robert Woods, you've seen this offense over the years. There's a lot of times where nobody's even covering him in the screen. And Odell's going to get situations there. When you look at Cleveland's offense, it's run first. It's a good rushing offense. But the pass game, specifically the drop back pass game, is very vanilla. It's very surface level. When you compare that to Sean McVay, it's a lot more elaborate. It's a lot more just diverse. And it helps wide receivers because Sean McVay, again, was a wide receiver. He understands. That also speaks to, he probably saw the tape and said, this guy can still play. I played wide receiver. I see it, right? So there's a lot of different levels to this. Now, the Rams weren't the only interested party. As we know, the Packers were the other team that was down to the wire with this decision for Odell. I think just the Rams and their overall all-in attitude, along with, all the players that I think approached Odell to come to LA, as well as the city, I think was a big factor here, as well as the LeBron connection. That all kind of factored into him going to the Rams. But the Packers were involved, the Seahawks were involved, the Saints were involved, the Patriots were involved. A lot of good teams with good front offices and good locker rooms were interested in Odell Beckham Jr. Now the question is, what role will Odell play in this offense, on this team? And I think people will have one or two answers. I think some people will think he'll just be Deshaun Jackson, which was kind of like this field stretcher. And some people will think he'll be like replacing Robert Woods. So personally, I feel he's neither. What I think OBJ is going to be for this team is essentially what Brandon Cooks was, but maybe a little bit more with some ball in his hands type plays, right? Screens. The Rams are a very good screen team. OBJ is a very good screen receiver, right? He's very good with the ball in his hands. Then on top of that, you've got the field stretching element. Brandon Cooks was a part of that trio. You had Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks. So now it's Cooper Kupp, Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, OBJ. So basically, Brandon Cooks was a 1,000-yard receiver in this offense. I think both of their skill sets are very similar in that way. They're very good intermediate and deep route runners, and they can separate at that level, and they bring a speed to the offense, but they're also good enough, over the middle of the field, catching the football in that fashion. So I think you're going to see a mix of, maybe some of those plays that would have went to Higbee or Van Jefferson or even Robert Woods in the screen game or the reverse game and what they do with their jet sweeps. Some of that's going to go to OBJ now because he's really good at it. But then also on top of that, you're going to see him run that intermediate deep route tree and allow Kupp and Woods to work underneath. And I think you're going to see maybe a little bit of Jefferson sparing for Woods and the primary receivers being Odell and Kupp when we really get down the stretch in the playoffs. And that's what I really think is going to happen. I think Robert Woods, if you've watched the Rams, I feel he has been the one to decline. Cooper Kupp's taken a step forward. I think Woods has slightly declined in his production, but also his skill set. I just don't think he's as explosive of a player, and I think that's where we've seen Van Jefferson, take some of his production away, because Van Jefferson is, I think, a closer player to Robert Woods than he is a Cooper Kupp at this point, and their skill sets are fairly similar. You're trying to build a wide receiver room like a basketball team, and it felt like the Rams had three players that were the same. They were short, intermediate, good route runners, good possession players, but they didn't have an explosive element. They were missing that player. Tutu Atwell on IR, Deshaun Jackson released. They needed that element. They've got that element now with OBJ. That's my opinion on it. So that is how he'll play in this offense. That's how he'll produce in this offense. How does he actually impact the players on the field? Personally, for fantasy, I believe that it's going to be a pecking order of Kupp still going to get a lot of looks because he has the rapport with Stafford, and I believe he's maybe even going to get more explosive plays because I think OBJ scares safeties and defenses to backing off of him, allowing him to work in a, let's just say, Randy Moss to Wes Welker type of dimension there. And then on top of that, I feel like Odell will get probably 5 catches a game, 4 or 5 catches a game. I think if you're looking for more than that, that would really mean maybe Odell's even better than I thought he was at this point. But then you've got Robert Woods as well, who will get his in the screen game, in the jet sweep game, and then also in the intermediate game. So I think you've got probably a tier of like Kupp and then OBJ and Woods on the same level, and then Van Jefferson, Higbee underneath that in terms of like fantasy looks, fantasy targets, fantasy production, and points. I don't see it being Kupp, Woods, OBJ. I think it's going to be Kupp, Woods, and OBJ on the same sort of level for fantasy purposes. So the question is for their hopes for the Super Bowl, because that's what they're doing here. They're all in, are the Rams. This was just another piece to add to the mix, and I think this was an amazing move. The reason I say it's an amazing move is because I feel like they legitimately had a need here. And then, secondly, it's a no-risk situation. If it doesn't work out, you can cut him. It doesn't really matter. But then you also have, I feel, if it doesn't work out to the level that you hoped, you could still involve him as a deep threat type player, as a Deshaun Jackson. And then you also can just release him in the offseason. You can get a comp pick, right? And that is probably what's going to end up happening. Is Odell's going to play here for the rest of the year. Whether they win the Super Bowl or not, he'll probably leave in free agency, get a better contract elsewhere as a number 1, number 2 on a good team. And that's maybe where he could go to like a Patriots or a Saints, a team that's looking for a number 1 receiver and kind of somewhat rebuilding right now, but could be really good next year. That's the type of team that might look at him, or maybe another team there like a Kansas City. So that is what I would really think is going to happen. So yeah, I'm really, really invested in this. I'm looking forward to seeing how he'll play as a Ram. I think this is an ideal spot, not only in terms of football, but also in terms of personal life. I think it's going to help Odell off and on the field. And I think his off the field is going to help his on the field, because I think his happiness will be brought back to his game, which I feel like Odell, a lot like Randy Moss and some of these other kind of character players, Ocho Cinco is this way, T.O. is this way. When they're happy, they're good. When they're off, when their personal life is off, when their just personal happiness is lower, they don't thrive the way that they usually do, even though their talent is still there. So I think Odell is ready, and I think he is going to take over with the Rams, and I think they're going to be a very good team and hard to stop. Now, if I had to say, are they going to win the Super Bowl? They've got a good chance. They've got a good chance. I think it's really between the Rams and the Bucs, ultimately. That's what I think it is. And both teams are very similar when you look at it, right? The only question to me is, will the Rams in the playoffs, let's just assume both teams are healthy, will the Rams have the chemistry the way the Bucs do, right? Are they ready to play in those big games the way that the Bucs have already shown that they can? And that might be the difference between the two, if you're to bet long term. But the Rams, going for that Super Bowl at home the same way Tampa Bay did, we'll see. It's going to be a lot of fun either way. And I think this just makes the NFL another element, another layer of exciting. So I'm looking forward to it. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you think this is a great move for the Rams? Do you think this is a good move for OBJ? What do you think OBJ is at this point in his career? Remember, guys, personally, I think he can still play. And remember, there's a lot of context besides your traditional stats. So it's Mitch. Thanks for watching. Peace.